Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Michael Lind. Mr. Lind is a writer and academic with a long history in the conservative movement. He co-founded the New America Foundation and has written for numerous publications, including The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, and The New Republic. Let's jump into our interview with Michael Lind. Mr. Lind, you moved from the East Coast to Texas a while back. You no longer teach at the University of Texas, but you did. It seems that a lot of intellectuals and more conservative-leaning individuals are moving to places like Texas. Why is that? What does Texas do right that other states do not?
Well, I think it's both Texas and Florida, and particularly big cities within those two states, Austin and Miami. People are not moving to the Florida Panhandle or, to rural West Texas. And I think it's a combination of several factors. One is being intellectuals, journalists, academics, and so on. They do want a metropolitan lifestyle, or at least a big enough critical mass of other people in these intellectual professions to interact with locally. Another factor is simply cheap real estate, which ironically is annihilated when everybody moves to Austin. Is now as expensive as Northern Virginia, D.C. area. And Miami, I think, is as expensive as New York City or getting there. And the third factor is simply the politics, and particularly not just center-right people, but also even some centrist liberals do not want to pay taxes and have to endure all of the regulations of these very woke, left-leaning Democratic states like New York and California.
Yeah, fascinating kind of dynamic that's developing there. Especially, I find it even among academics that I interact with. There's a kind of sense that it might be time to try to find other traditional kind of centers of discussion. I wanted to just kind of move us really quickly to the poll that just came out by the New York Times, really kind of showing what some would say is a horror show for President Biden. Do you think there are some dynamics that are, completely different about 2024 than there were at 2020? Do you think that the issue of the Republican Party being painted as anti-minority, and yet in every election since 2016, the GOP has gained support with those constituencies? How do you see that kind of changing or shifting in the kind of the current moment?
Well, it's true that we're seeing what some have called class depolarization. I'm sorry, racial depolarization and class polarization. So racial identity is becoming less and less important for voting than class identity. And this is something many people have described. I described it as the polarization between the college-educated overclass and the working class of all races in my book, The New Class War in 2020. Some call it the diploma divide, but it's really a class divide, and it will become more and more important in the future. But before we talk about electoral politics, I think we shouldn't assume that because the political system is more or less competitive between Republicans and Democrats, that the social order is, the social establishment. If you want to be paranoid about it, the regime, the major institutions in American life, corporations, banks, investment banks, Wall Street, tech, are all aligned at this point more with the Democrats than with the Republicans. Some corporations and trade associations split the difference, and they've done this for decades, giving money both to Democrats and Republicans for lobbying purposes. But pretty much we have a fairly competitive two-party electoral system And we have absolute one-party hegemony in society, in at least the upper branches of elite society. And it's worse, as you know, with the universities and the major media. So, for example, at the University of Texas at Austin, my alma mater, where I taught for a while, 96% of the faculty, according to one poll, are Democrats. And they're very liberal Democrats. And in 2017, the faculty of the University of Texas at Austin, this is a red state, by the way, supposedly a conservative state, voted unanimously to require Texas counties to falsify birth certificates. If a man at the age of 60, say, decided that he'd really been a woman all along, and then the University of Texas professors wanted to require the registrars in Texas counties to go back and falsify the birth certificate, saying that this middle-aged man had been born a little girl. So I guess what I'm saying is it matters to some degree who wins the presidency, but in another sense, the Republicans have already lost the elite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating, those dynamics.
Well, and the result of it, if I can continue just briefly, is
Yes.
the only institution in which Republicans and conservatives have any representation at the elite level, including even the military, they've lost that, is politics. It's electoral politics. And so the basic strategic division, I think, within the Republican Party is, do you continue this anti-statism where you're trying to reduce the power of the only entity that conservative voters have any influence in, which is the government? And do you want to keep cutting taxes on rich people who, for the last decade or so now, most of the richest neighborhoods in the country have very Democratic, liberal members of Congress? The country club Democrats, as it were, have replaced the country club Republicans. So I think you see people like DeSantis, for example, and also Republicans like Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance and Hawley. I think they've adapted to this new situation in which they see it legitimate, in some cases, to use the power of government to redress the imbalance of power in civil society. But the older generation of libertarian conservatives, are fundamentally anti-statist, and they want to weaken the government even when their constituents control the government.
Right. I mean, I'm dying to follow up on that just briefly because, as you may recall, you and I first met when we were part of a same discussion group of Kevin Phillips's, the Cousins Wars, and I'm wondering, if you think there are kind of internecine divides, dating back to those kind of important cultural moments, in America's founding and before, that are kind of inhering in the current election, or is that too highfalutin and too far to intellectualize what's going on?
No, not at all. I think if you look at an entire transatlantic West, you get a similar polarization between what I call the overclass, the college-educated professional class. And it's not the capitalists as such. Most successful capitalists who are self-made are simply college-educated professional class people who made $1 billion, but they don't belong to a separate fox-hunting, polo-playing aristocracy by any means. So I do think the managerial professional class is dominant. And the core of it is about 15% of the population, but about 40% get a BA. So you get a kind of proletarianized version of the managerial class, but it's still a minority. And the majority of people are working class. They graduate from high school and go to work and get jobs. And that's the major division in every Western country. Within particular Western countries, some regions, some classes, some religious groups have always been more capable of entering the educational elite, which is, the educational credential is now the passport to elite status. than other groups. And in the English-speaking world, you've always had Anglicans in Britain, Episcopalians in the United States, have tended to dominate the institutions of higher education. So did Puritans, Congregationalists, and others. And at the same time, for 300 or 400 years, other groups in Britain, the Scots-Irish and Ulster, the Scots and the Irish, the Scots, there were the pre-modern Scots who were very rowdy and came to the U.S. and became Appalachian Scots-Irish and contributed to my rather mixed ancestry. There was another later group of highly educated Scots who became engineers, particularly in the British Empire. Thus, the stereotype of Mr. Scott, the engineer in Star Trek, and they were very influential in Canada, moving to Canada. So the Scots proper are different from the Scots-Irish, but historically in the U.S., there's always been a culture war, which also tends to be a class war between the Northeastern Puritans and their diaspora in the Great Lakes region and the West Coast, and everybody else. Basically, the two major opponents of the New England Puritans have been the Southerners, both the Anglican Episcopalian elite Southerners and the somewhat ethnically different Scots-Irish Calvinists in Appalachia, Greater Appalachia, but also Catholics, of whom Irish Catholics were the most important. So from the days of Andrew Jackson to the present, you find that most white working class Catholics and most white working class Scots-Irish are part of the same party. And it's the party that opposes the party dominated by the New England Protestants, and also the people who assimilate to the New England Protestant culture. And this is very important because people assimilate. There are multiple melting pots in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So there's a separate college-educated melting pot and then a working-class melting pot. And we're seeing this now with Mexican Americans. Mexican American working-class people are becoming more and more like, to use the term favorably, Scots-Irish rednecks. There was a comedian a few years ago who was both of Scots-Irish and Mexican descent. I've forgotten his name. He called himself the Red Mexican. And this is not surprising because, white working class culture, particularly the cowboy culture, the clothing, the cowboy hats, the boots, the ranch lifestyle, all of that came from northern Mexico. It's actually the one place in the Western Hemisphere where the British immigrants assimilated to the Spanish culture rather than vice versa. And the other group is Catholics. White Catholics are disproportionately Republican, even though Catholics as a whole, largely because of Hispanic immigrants, still vote somewhat for Democrats. But there's a Puritan melting pot too, because the culture of the elite universities of the Ivy League, which sets the tone for the major research universities and all the other schools trying to catch up with them. This has always been kind of New England Puritan, even in a secularized form. And Yale, Harvard, these were basically divinity schools when they were founded. Mm-hmm. And all the way up until the mid-19th century, the president of an Ivy League college was always a Protestant minister, and usually gave the capstone course was in Protestant natural theology. Right. So they became somewhat secular, but you see this declension between mainline Protestantism and some kinds of Congregationalism, and it becomes social gospel Protestantism by the turn of the century. And that's basically what wokeism is now, in my opinion. And lots of people have traced this Puritanism. If you look at woke culture, it's concentrated in the English-speaking countries. So you're quite right to mention Kevin Phillips. It's much weaker in Latin countries and in countries with Catholic traditions.
Right. I just offer one last comment that, I remember, I was trying to complete my doctorate in Oxford. I, didn't have the money to go home over Christmas break. And so, I went to a service at St. Mary's Church, the sort of, center of Anglican thinking. And I was just astonished that so much of the Christmas ceremony was about, Palestine. And when I see, the kind of Jeremiads for Palestine and all the, it's very much, I think, a kind of manifestation of that round-headed, version of reality, and so it's interesting to see the subtext of that kind of transcending, the kind of global managerial class that you so often critique, and still being present in the kind of really brutal culture wars we're fighting. But we could go on in this, but
just one more point. So I've followed James Burnham and John Kenneth Galbraith and others in arguing that today we're dominated by managerial capitalism, not by old-fashioned bourgeois individualist capitalism. This has been the case really for nearly a century. But I think some people on the right in particular, there's a debate as to whether managerial capitalism is the source of wokeness, or whether you can have non-woke managerialism. And I'm in the latter camp. That is, I think that, large bureaucratic corporations, government agencies, and nonprofits are here to stay for centuries or millennia to come. This is just the new pattern of technological civilization. This particular kind of neo-Puritan wokeness is not universal among managerial capitalist countries. As I said, it's concentrated in English-speaking countries. And it really is kind of a historical fluke that the managerial and professional elites in the United States are disproportionately educated, shall we say, indoctrinated by these institutions, which still have kind of a lingering secularized Puritan culture. So I think the goal has to be to de-Puritanize the United States, but this whole business about dismantling the administrative state and getting rid of big corporations and so on, that's just a children's crusade. It's not going to happen. We need a non-woke, good managerial regime in the public interest, but we're not going to get rid of managerialism in the public, private, nonprofit sectors.
Right. And I also try to remind people when they do, I think, see the link between wokeness and the kind of Puritan heritage of the United States, that there was a great contribution of the Puritans to American civilization, and their belief that dissent against tyranny is piety to God. I mean, this is sort of central, I think, to American thinking about government, and so it's certainly a complicated historical picture. I don't know if you would agree, but
I would put it this way: most groups in the U.S., including the ancestors of the Jacksonian base, the Scots-Irish and the Irish Catholics in the North, came to the U.S. not to create a new utopia, but to be left the hell alone, or to get rich, or both, right? So in the old country, they had been poor, or they had been persecuted for their religion or ethnicity. And so they basically wanted to be left alone and make some money. So it was very, very materialistic, transactional attitude towards government, the Jacksonian tradition, and very hostile to any kind of sweeping social reform projects. And often it was allied, that made Jacksonians useful allies for the Southern planters who could mobilize racism and so on. But basically it was not a utopian vision of the U.S. as a unique country. And so with the exception of Native Americans and African slaves, the only people who came to North America because the old country was too free and too prosperous were the Puritans. So, they left because Britain was not repressive enough, and it was too commercial and consumerist. So while it's true that at times the Puritans have always looking for projects of reform to throw their zeal behind, they've thrown their zeal behind some great projects like the abolition of slavery and later anti-racist civil rights. But they were also responsible for prohibition, which was a disaster.
Yes.
And the public school system, the United States is the only Anglophone country in which government money, and with few exceptions, cannot go to Catholic pre-K schools or Baptist pre-K schools for that matter. And that's just pure anti-Catholic prejudice. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and Ireland, the money follows the student. As long as you have qualified schools, eligible schools, then the government funds sectarian schools as well as public schools. So basically in the 19th century, we remember the New England crusade against slavery, rightly so. We forget about their crusade against Catholic parochial schools and against Mormon polygamy. So basically, they saw themselves as, basically the only civilized people. There was a transition from being religious to kind of being enlightened and civilized among Northern Whigs and Republicans in the 19th century. And the Irish and the Southerners and the Mormons were just barbarians and had to be repressed, and then they had to be assimilated to the Northern Protestant model. And this is the subtext, and people often get this wrong. The New Deal was not simply a move to the left in economics, and arguably it wasn't that left-wing economically anyway. It was a Jacksonian counter-revolution against the cultural and educational and financial hegemony of Northeastern mainline Protestants. So FDR was a Dutch New Yorker. He had some English descent, but he was constantly needling the WASPs about how he was really Dutch. And the Dutch, going back to Martin van Buren, often sided with the Jacksonians out of annoyance with their Puritan neighbors in the Northeast.
Can we build on that point about FDR? I know you wrote a bit about FDR and you talked about the New Deal, and you argued basically that what's happened is we have an anti-worker welfare state, which is not what FDR and the sort of New Deal Democrats wanted. What they wanted was sort of a living wage with social insurance as a system. Talk about that a bit, what they had in mind and where we are today and what it should look like.
Well, since FDR was president for 4 terms, there were multiple New Deals. People talk about a first and second and third New Deal, and they were somewhat contradictory. The first one was very corporatist or tripartist. It was based on government, business, labor collaboration under the National Recovery Act, and then that was struck down by the Supreme Court. And then in the second New Deal, particularly after the recession of 1937, FDR sided with some antitrust thinkers, including Thurman Arnold. But then he reversed himself again, and then there was sort of World War II mobilization and so on. So I think the best way to think about the New Deal is not to look at the Roosevelt administration as such. He wasn't a dictator, even though people accused him of being one. Is to look at Congress. So what was the New Deal in terms of congressional legislation and electoral politics? Well, the core coalition of the New Deal was not progressives. Progressives played some role, particularly in the agencies and in the intelligentsia, but it was basically a farmer-labor coalition. It was the Jacksonian working class in the Northeast. They wanted the government to recognize and back trade unions. And then the populist farmers of the South and West wanted government price supports and things like that, and federal deposit insurance, which was important for farmers. Because, in order to stabilize the farm economy against wild fluctuations. And then finally, the other important group, which is forgotten about, the Southern elite and also the California elite, who are often quite reactionary, they wanted infrastructure development. They wanted highways and rural electrification paid for by the federal government. Well, why the federal government? Why didn't they pay for it themselves? Well, as young Congressman Lyndon Johnson told constituents in the 1930s when they asked who would pay for all of these dams and highways, he said the Yankee millionaires.
I want to interject and say there's a certain irony in that, which I think some of our listeners will get, which is his entire political career was funded by the Brown Root Company in Texas, who had plenty of money on their own.
Well, that's the thing. The Southern elite was split from the Civil War up through the New Deal between the reactionary neo-Confederates, who were quite fine with being an agrarian and resource colony of industrial capitalists in the American Northeast and also in Britain and Western Europe. But there were modernizers in the South, and Brown and Root and Jesse Jones, the banker who became from Houston, who became the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the most important New Deal agency. They wanted to catch up with the Northeast. And, one reason they used the federal government, and this is relevant to what we were talking about earlier, using the federal government for your purposes, to use the federal government was because they could not raise loans on Wall Street from the 1880s all the way up to the 1930s for major infrastructure and industrial projects in the Northeast, in the South and also in the West Coast. Well, why is that? Well, it's because up until the New Deal separated investment banking and commercial banking and regular banking, retail banking, you had universal banking in the U.S., like the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan. The House of Morgan had its representatives sit on the boards of many railroad and industrial corporations. So in other words, the House of Morgan was not really a bank in the conventional sense. It wasn't even an investment bank. It was actually it was an investment. They were venture capitalists. They were capitalists. They owned or controlled these major industrial corporations. And in their view, in the New York bankers' view of the world, which was perfectly rational from their perspective, circa 1900, the Midwest grew corn, the South grew cotton and cattle. The mountain states provided iron ore and copper, and California was for oranges, right? And so they didn't need factories. The factories were in Pittsburgh and in various other northeastern places, in Detroit. And the railroads, owned by industrial capitalists in many cases, conspired against economic development by states in the South and the West. So to give you an example from my native Texas, the railroads ensured that it cost more. This was back around the turn of the century, 1900. It cost more to ship a nail from a factory in Austin to a factory in Waco, a few miles north, than it did to ship a nail from a factory in Pittsburgh to Waco. This was differential pricing, and the purpose of it was to kill off any southern factories that could compete with the northern and some of the Midwestern factories. So, strangely enough, the conservative Southern business class of the New Deal era, which often was quite racist and classist, they were not populists, they were not liberals, but in order to modernize their region, they saw the only option for them was state capitalism, was to dominate Congress through the dominant Southern Democrats, most of whom were quite reactionary themselves, but then to tax the Northeastern industrial core and to fund the development of businesses in the South and the West, which could compete with the private sector capitalists of the North. And the great tragedy of the New Deal was that the really ardent New Dealers wanted to have a social revolution and a racial revolution at the same time as this state capitalist, federally sponsored development of the South and the West. They were defeated. And so consequently, you did have the revolutionary, federally sponsored industrial modernization of the South and the West, particularly during World War II, when a lot of defense plants were put in Texas and Florida and California. But at the same time, these Southern New Dealers opposed anything that might increase the bargaining power of labor, like unions, and civil rights for African Americans.
I want to shift a bit to talk about your views on the radical center. So you wrote a book about the radical center. Talk about it a bit, what it has looked like in the past in the U.S. and how it should look in the U.S. moving forward. It seems that right now we're very far from it. When you go to MSNBC or CNN or Fox, you never see someone who's a moderate in Congress being quoted, or when you do, it's rare. How should this look, and how's it looked in the past?
Well, the radical center was the title favored by my co-author, Ted Halstead. I'm not a big fan of it. But if you look at our book, it actually was kind of proto-Trumpy in as much as we favored restricting low-wage immigration to help boost wages. And we didn't get into industrial policy that much. But at the time, it seems like ages ago, there really was a kind of a transition in the late 90s and the 2000s where it wasn't clear which way the country would go, which party would become dominant. And so we had support from people like John McCain. We had Democrats who praised and supported us. And it became clear by 2010, I think 2020, that window of opportunity for like adumbrating a new center had pretty much closed. And as I said earlier, I think it's closed because we now have a two-party political system and a one-party regime. That is, it's clear at this point to me, the Democrats dominate everything except the political system narrowly defined. And I'm not even sure conservatism. This is why I don't like even left and right, because I think really it's the inside versus the outside. And it's the establishment, which is culturally liberal and economically free market, neoliberal, in favor of offshoring and mass low-wage immigration to suppress wages and weaken unions. But at the same time, they want to fire people for saying that a man cannot become a woman. So it's this synthesis of the cultural left and the economic right, which is not what we had in mind as the radical center. But I think that's now the orthodoxy. It's the establishment. And against it, I don't even think there's a coherent right. I think there's basically this aggressive elite progressivism, which, having demolished the economic counterweights to their power, and they're in the private sector. These are not government bureaucrats or socialists or anything like that. I mean, these are, it's people like Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and Bill Gates. They're the ones who fund, and George Soros. They fund all of these causes. Basically, they crushed the unions through immigration and offshoring between the 1970s and the 2010s. Now the only resistance to them is not only economic resistance, although they're threatened by Trump-type protectionism and by Sanders-type socialism, but it's basically cultural. They want their values to prevail, and their values are those of the upper middle class, of the upper class. They're not secret. It's just they're very radically libertine on all sex and reproduction matters, and anti-tradition. They, like rich people through the ages, they're interested in the new latest fad, and they don't like tradition. And I think so. It's actually what we're seeing now with wokeness. You could put it this way: it's the second phase of the campaign for the hegemony of this oligarchy that has emerged in the United States since the 90s and the 2000s. And it's primarily, in my view, it's not a managerial elite per se. That is, it's not CEOs and vice presidents of corporations and so on who are pushing this stuff. It's rentier capitalists. It's rich capitalists who made their money, like Gates and Bezos and Soros. And what they don't care about making more money. They're not hawking their book. They just want their social liberal values imposed because they think they're right. They want them imposed in the U.S. and they want them imposed worldwide. So I think that's how I see this. It's and then on the right, basically, I don't think there is a right. I think there is an anti-progressive alliance, and it's everyone from anti-woke social democrats and democratic socialists to the religious right, to the secular Jacksonians, to libertarians, and so on. And the weakness of this anti-progressive coalition is that each element of the coalition is threatened by one or another aspect of this aggressive revolution from above, being pushed by these rentier oligarchs, particularly through the NGOs and the universities and the media, but also through government when they control it. But these different anti-progressive groups have nothing in common, and in many cases, their views are totally incompatible, right? So just because you hate wokeness and you're an old-fashioned Marxist doesn't mean you have anything else in common, with an anti-woke libertarian or an anti-woke Christian conservative. So that's what I see happening. I see this very successful consolidation of power in the economy by this new oligarchy. It's a capitalist oligarchy, but they're operating as rich individuals rather than as trying to promote the particular industries that made them rich long ago.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot to the kind of, increasing economic side to American politics. I do think at this point we should turn to foreign policy. And, one thing I really want to ask is just how you see the moment of great power competition that we're, either fully entered or just, wading into, how that's going to affect American domestic politics, because I think this is a kind of often ignored side of it. Do you see there being a kind of shift being emphasized or reinforced by what's happening in the world? Or
well, two things. In the short term, yes, there is a shift, and it is bipartisan. So the neoliberal foreign policy, which I've called the Pax Americana foreign policy, assumed that the U.S. would be the sole superpower for decades or generations or centuries to come, and that China would be kind of like Mexico. It would be a low-cost producer of offshore factory goods. Russia would just wither away, and the U.S. would police the world on behalf of this integrated global market. And that was the vision. And the U.S. would deindustrialize by sending manufacturing abroad to low-wage labor camps, but at the same time, it would focus on the innovation economy, the knowledge economy. We would invent things, and they would be made by poor, unfree workers in Mexico or China or India or whatever. That was the vision. It was a very colonial, imperial vision, down to our policing the world, with small wars of regime change periodically, to install client states that would go along with this geopolitical program of Washington. Now, you cannot have a global economy if there's more than one great power. If in a bipolar system or a multipolar system, you can't have global free trade, because the great powers are not going to allow themselves to become economically dependent in the long run, in the short run maybe, on the enemy powers and their client states. So inevitably, in my view, as a realist, I've always been a sort of classical small R realist, the rise of what is now militarily and geopolitically, it's a bipolar system, because China is really the only other, power with global influence and not global reach, in the sense that they don't have navies patrolling the Gulf of Mexico, but they don't need it because they have economic power and they have financial power, and their civilian industrial power can be translated into military power very quickly, as ours was with World War I and World War II. So you're inevitably going to get the collapse of trade to parallel the geopolitical alliances of the U.S. and of China. Now, many countries will resist this. They will try to play one off against the other, which makes perfect sense. from their point of view. So just as in the Cold War, the first Cold War, Cold War I, you had the non-aligned nations of South America and China, India, playing off the Soviet Union and against China then against the U.S. I think you're going to have this non-aligned movement, and countries will try to make China and the U.S. compete for investment in them, for access to their markets and labor, and so on. So I think in the long run that's inevitable. In the short run, the neoliberal establishment is kind of confused. I think they're honestly confused intellectually. They think, well, this is basically right. We basically can't have a global rule-governed market if we're in a Cold War with China and with its de facto allies like Russia and Iran and North Korea. But what we'll do is we'll have an industrial policy, but it will be the most minimal kind that doesn't really require us to rethink any other aspects of banking or labor or investment or so on. And what's more, at least in the case of the left, not the right, the left neoliberals say, and our industrial policy has to be focused mainly on the green transition, the alleged transition from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuel energy, which frankly, I do not think is going to happen in the 21st century. It may never happen at all, since there are inexhaustible amounts of hydrocarbons in the form of methane clathrates under the sea, among others, as well as nuclear energy. But be that as it may, we've seen it's kind of I think of it as a placebo industrial policy. So we have people saying, Biden has broken with neoliberalism, his industrial policy, but it's the weakest and most ineffectual industrial policy you can imagine. First of all, it's the wrong industries. Now, the CHIPS Act was not Biden's accomplishment. It was an accomplishment of years of people working together in the Senate, in particular. But give him some credit for signing that. The CHIPS Act was geostrategic. That is, it is essential that the U.S. not be dependent on Taiwan, given its vulnerability to China for any technological inputs. We have to either reassure those or friend-shore those, move them to friendly allies as quickly as possible. So the CHIPS Act, at least the goal was right. The goal in the case of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the Green New Deal under a false name, that was just completely misguided, because we're going to try to rapidly build up all of these solar wind solar panels and wind turbines and things like that, which depend largely on Chinese inputs. And even if that were not the case, we would be dumping all of these products in global markets against subsidized Chinese competition, which will undersell them. So the Green New Deal is completely incoherent as industrial policy. Both the goal and the methods are wrong. The CHIPS Act, the method is legitimate. I'm sorry, the goal is legitimate, but the method is wrong. And the method used both by the CHIPS Act and the Green New Deal /IRA is subsidies. This is the least efficient form of industrial policy, which is why hardly any country uses it. Most countries either use tariffs to protect their internal markets to build up national champions in that industry, or they use so-called policy banks. These are specialized government investment banks. We have one in the form of the Export-Import Bank. But so China, for example, has an infrastructure bank and had a manufacturing bank. There's a European infrastructure bank. The least effective thing you can do if you want to build up your solar panel industry or your chips industry is to promise unlimited tax credits, which are government tax, it's got this form of government spending, on any company which builds factories in the U.S., regardless of whether they sell those goods in the world market or not, right? This is an invitation to all these corporations to set up all of these Potemkin village factories and collect billions and trillions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. And then when they can't sell anything because of Chinese mercantilism, they've already cashed the checks from the American taxpayer. So Trump is wrong about many things, but one thing he's right about is, you need tariffs if you want to have, and the alternative to tariffs, which we used successfully in the United States before 1945 and building up infant industries, is socialist factories. People, which we had the arsenal system in the U.S. One of the first acts of legislation that President Washington, former Commander-in-Chief Washington, signed was the arsenal system. This created government-owned military factories. They were socialist military factories in Springfield, Connecticut, and in around the country, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And these were government-owned factories, and they were run by either the Army or in some cases by the Navy, the shipyards. And so all the way from the 1790s up until after World War II, the U.S. military and the Navy owned their own factories and made their own weapons. And in wartime, for example, in the Civil War, but also in World War I and World War II, they then leased out contracts to private contractors in order to convert their production to civilian production. But then after the war, when the civilian war production collapsed, the government factories continued to make the weapons at government expense without needing to make a profit in the commercial sector. And tragically, we abandoned this system after 1945. The abandonment was pioneered by the Air Force because the Air Force had originally been the Army Air Force. It had been the air wing of the Army. Mm. And the Air Force fought successfully in Congress to become its own service. But because the arsenals were all literally owned by the Army and the Navy, the Air Force had to turn to private plane manufacturers as defense contractors. And that's where we got the modern defense contractor model. And defense contractors have a role, but there are obvious problems, as you can imagine, with having an industry where there is one customer, the Pentagon, and two or three contractors, all of whom have to be kept from going bankrupt, no matter how inefficient they are.
I want to ask a bit about Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan. You previously had stated that Afghanistan is an unexploded landmine and that the U.S. did all this for nothing. And moreover, you said we'll pay for it in the future. How are we going to pay for this in the future? And did we gain anything from the war in Afghanistan and our involvement in the war on terror?
Oh, I think the war on terror was a mistake from the beginning. Now, it was correct to punish the Taliban regime for harboring bin Laden and al-Qaeda. But once he had fled from our enemy, Afghanistan, to the protection of our ally, Pakistan, and nobody can persuade me that we did not know for years and years that our so-called ally, Pakistan, was actually harboring al-Qaeda, and that they did not play a role in his execution by U.S. forces. But that's another story. So the basic question was, what we deposed the Taliban, and I think initially that was legitimate. Obviously, if Honduras had been the base for a site, that took out, much of Manhattan or Washington or Miami or Austin, then I think you overthrow the regime. But the problem is, in the civil war that followed, it became clear that the Taliban represent Pashtun ethnic nationalism. They were not just jihadists. And so the U.S. was claiming that they were just a bunch of radical Salafists and they had no particular Afghan social ties. But that was wrong. It was one thing to be against Catholicism if you're a Cromwellian Protestant. It's quite another to be against all Irish Catholics for whom Catholicism is part of their identity. And so one reason why the U.S. was doomed to lose in Pakistan is that Pakistan is not a real country. It's one of these post-colonial agglomerations where the lines during the colonial era were deliberately drawn by the British imperialists to divide different ethnic groups and to lump them together in territorial units so that they would fight each other. So, for example, the Durand Line between Pakistan and Afghanistan divides these Pashtun populations, which is why there were Pashtuns on both sides in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. So the U.S. Now, what you could do is you could correct the borders, and I'm in favor of this. There have been about 30 new countries have originated since the end of the Cold War from the dissolution of the USSR and Yugoslavia and Somalia. And one way we found that pretty effectively ends ethnic wars within a state is to put an international border between the fighting parties. It's very effective for many, many different reasons. And if the ethnic nationalists want a state of their own so that they're not screwed over by their tribal enemies in the federal government, then I'm not against giving them a state of their own. But the U.S. line towards Afghanistan was there's an Afghan people, instead of this being a kind of a hodgepodge like Yugoslavia or the USSR, that can only be held together by force, probably. Or it can also be held together by coalition. So once it became clear that most supporters of the Taliban didn't care about al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but they were Pashtun Islamists, and they were against the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and these other ethnic groups. At that point, we should have either split it up into sovereign countries or have a coalition government on consociational lines. That means where all of the ethnic groups are allotted guaranteed places in government. And successful multinational states with consociational governments include Switzerland, Bosnia, interestingly enough, insisted on it because they're divided between Croats, Muslims, and Serbs. And so you get these institutions, for example, in Switzerland, where the presidency rotates among German speakers, French speakers, Romansh speakers, and Italian speakers. So those are the two options with a multinational state. Instead, the U.S. persisted in defining the Taliban as being nothing but terrorists and global jihadists, which they weren't, most of them, and carrying out like programs of social reform, promoting feminism and gay rights and so on, which I support where their circumstances permit them to exist. But they were simply antagonizing this pre-modern tribal population, making them hate the Americans all the more. So the United States in Afghanistan was not only an imperial power, but it was a completely maladroit, incompetent imperial power. It didn't even act like an intelligent imperial power would have acted, which would have been either to partition it or to create a coalition of government and then get out by 2010 or so.
I really appreciate that polemical.
George, I would also say real quick, if I could, that the U.S. tried to do something similarly in Iraq, right? Joe Biden famously had plans of 3 different states between the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis. Have we seen an instance, you point out some that have happened in like Bosnia, but have we seen an instance where the U.S. has effectively set up different tiers of government within a Middle Eastern country?
Well, Biden, I think, was right. Iraq should have been partitioned. It was all created one night by the French ambassador, by a French diplomat and a British diplomat in the 1920s, like on a piece of paper carving up the Ottoman Empire, and they wanted access. And so the French got Lebanon and the British got Iraq, but then they carved out these states like Qatar so the British Petroleum would control the oil wells. I mean, there's no reason why these borders that were invented by European colonialists 100 years ago, they don't correspond to the social reality, why they should be around for thousands and thousands of years, So in practice, the U.S. has tended to resist this. And I know this from the late Richard Holbrooke, who negotiated the Dayton Accords in So, as I mentioned, the Bosnians wanted a consociational system in which each ethnic group would have guaranteed representation and you would share power. The American experts, not Holbrooke himself, he was mainly a diplomat, but the experts in democratic theory, paid for by our government and academics and so on, they were opposed to that. They wanted majoritarian liberal democracy with minority rights, showing that the U.S. is a menace to itself and the world when it tries to export its own model. And while I'm being polemical, I should say that the National Institute of Democracy, and particularly the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican Institute, these have done enormous damage. It didn't surprise me that Catherine Mayer, the new head of PBS, got her start in the National Democratic Institute. These are people who generally do not understand particular area cultures in depth. Some years ago, I was on a plane to Europe. No, it was actually Latin America, with two Republican experts from the national. No, it was Europe. I'm sorry, they were going to Eastern Europe. So the national. Do you know what these are? The National Republican Institute.
Very intimately. Yeah, I'm definitely familiar with these. They're under the National Endowment for Democracy.
National Endowment for Democracy. Thanks for the correction. But basically, this was a slush fund set up to give money. Initially, it was to the talentless children of influential people in D.C. after the Cold War, and then they would go and they would talk about the Federalist Papers and the wonders of multi-party democracy, initially to Eastern Europe. And so I was on the plane with these Republican operatives going to Eastern Europe, and they were going to tell them everybody should read the Federalist Papers and copy the American legal system. So I said, well, what are you going to say about the civil law system? And they said, what is that? So these National Republican Institute lawyers, they were lawyers. They were unaware that outside of the English-speaking world, with common law countries, all countries have a version of Roman law, of continental European civil law. They'd never heard of it.
Right.
And this is basically the story of our post-Cold War empire. I mean, I remember there was a young woman who had graduated with a degree in urban planning that I read about, who was put in charge in traffic in Baghdad during the opposition. I'm during the occupation. So the U.S., just to sum this up, was born in an anti-imperial revolution. We promoted the dissolution of the European empires, both for idealistic reasons and selfish commercial reasons, during and after World War II and the Cold War. And so from the end of the Cold War, I thought this whole experiment in a quasi-imperial Pax Americana was doomed to failure just because we're not that kind of people. I mean, we are not the sort of nation which is willing to have a foreign legion go and pacify some tribe for 20 or 30 years. Now, maybe that would help us marginally in some ways, but that's not how the American way of war.
Right.
And we don't have what the British did have. The British Empire had these people like Lawrence of Arabia. They would go and they would live in a country. They would often marry into the local elite. They would speak the language. They would wear the clothing. They would become just completely assimilated culturally. But they were always British, and they would betray their new in-laws at a moment's notice if London told them to. That's not what American diplomats and soldiers do.
Would you say that, in this environment in which we're, facing countries that are very sophisticated in the art of disinformation, there has to be some kind of American response, to, propagating American values and trying to, persuade other populations that, alliance with the United States or our way of life is not something threatening? I mean, how do you respond to that kind of impulse, which I think pervades Washington? Is it just a kind of empty, sappy, rosy view of the world, or, I know this is, but it's sort of an important point to end on, given your critique of IRI and NDI. And
well, in my book, The American Way of Strategy, I made what I think is sort of a subtle argument. I'm not sure everybody got it, which is that if you go back and look at what Roosevelt said, and actually what Woodrow Wilson said, they did not say that the goal of U.S. foreign policy should be to make all countries democratic. They never said that, even Wilson. They said we need a world order that is safe for a democratic way of life in the U.S. and other democracies, even if other countries are not democratic. We hope they will be in the long run, but the long run may be centuries or millennia. So what is a world order that is safe for the American way of life? And again, I was just reviving this lost tradition of thought in the U.S. according to the Wilson and Roosevelt and Eisenhower. I mean, this is the sub-theme of his military-industrial complex speech. You can't really have a flourishing, liberal, pluralistic, individualistic democracy if you have to be mobilized for war. And so mobilization for war can have two causes. One cause can be simply tyranny. You have a government that whips up imaginary threats in order to mobilize the country for war, choking off the economy and bring about censorship and propaganda and all of that. But the threat that Wilson and Roosevelt and Eisenhower were worried about was when you have no choice but to mobilize for war defensively, because the Axis powers control Eurasia, or because the Soviets are in the Caribbean, or because China, is becoming the dominant trading partner of most countries in the world, including allies of ours. So for them, the world wars and the Cold War were a kind of reluctant exercise in defensive military mobilization. The idea was you would mobilize, but you would defeat the aggression of the other side soon enough that you did not have to become a permanently mobilized Fortress America. Well, but what does defeat mean? What does defeating the other side mean? For none of them, not for Roosevelt, or Roosevelt was kind of anti-German, actually very anti-German, but for most of the American policymakers recognized, even if you get rid of the Nazi regime or the Imperial German regime or the Soviet regime, Germany and Russia and Japan and now China are going to be great powers, forever. India is joining the great power ranks. Britain and France are falling out. Now, we would like them to be democratic, but we can have a world safe for democracy, even if they are authoritarian states that are not aggressive, so that we have no need to have a Cold War budget, right? So I know it's kind of a paradox, but my argument in the American Way of Strategy is a world safe for democracy is a world in which all of the great powers are status quo powers. None of them is aggressive and trying to overturn the system. It's nice if they're liberal and democratic, but they don't have to be. And conversely, in theory, you could have like a radical revolutionary democratic regime that wants to export its democracy that threatens us, right? So this is not conventional realism, because conventional realism basically assumes that it's always a perpetual state of war. This is a somewhat more optimistic view, that you can have periods of great power peace, even if the great powers have different regimes, as long as they agree on not engaging in military or quasi-military competition. And I think we need to think about this now. It's Cold War II. What would victory be defined as? If victory is defined in my terms as a status quo Russia and a status quo China that are no longer bullying their neighbors and building up their militaries in a threatening, aggressive way, then we can live in peace with them and we can cut our defense budget. We have to keep some, but we'll still have trade rivalries and so on, but it will be low level. I'm afraid with Biden talking about the global battle between democracies and autocracies that we will define victory as multi-party liberal democracy in Beijing and Moscow, which I don't think is likely to happen.
Right. You've been so generous with your time. We really appreciate your speaking with us. It's just been so stimulating. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.